Live. Live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Empower Hour that we in Womenintech Oslo organize with the aim to empower, educate, and elevate our community. I'm Eva, and together with Ingrid, Alice, and another members of Womenintech Oslo, we are happy to have with us our amazing speaker, Sonya Natanzon, from whom we'll learn about the role of the software architect. Sonya is an engineering leader and software architect with many years of experience. She worked in a number of different industries, but the healthcare engagements were the most rewarding in her career. If you have any questions, please use the comment section or the chat below, and we'll bring those questions to at the end of the talk. Sonya, nice seeing you, and the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Good evening, everybody. Hi. It is good morning to me. Welcome to So You Think You Might Be an Architect. I spoke at a conference probably a couple of years ago at this point when those things were still in person, and I introduced myself as a software engineer who is now a software architect. After my talk, one of the attendees approached me and asked, I am a senior engineer. How do I become a software architect? And what is the role of software architect? What do they do? My response went like this. Do you know what the difference is between a senior engineer and an architect? Well, architects can draw pretty diagrams. It was a joke, of course, but some days at work do feel like it. After the joke, I told them that the definition of software architect is a little nebulous. The path to becoming one can be windy and not well defined. And in the remaining break, I listed out some things that software architects do. And I told them, if you're finding yourself doing these things, you might already be an architect, even though no one's given you the title. And that got me thinking, how do I explain the role of a software architect and what she does? Last time I thought about it was when my son was about 6. I was bringing him home from school and he wanted me to carry his backpack. He said he was tired. And I told him, well, I'm tired too. I worked all day. And he responded, but all you do is press computer buttons. And while that was very true, it is a lot of what I do, there is so much more to my job. And how do I convey that to either a 6-year-old or to anyone else? There are a few different ways of explaining the role of a software architect. The shortest one is through a great tagline. My friend who is head of product described the work of product team as build stuff we can sell and sell stuff we can build. And I thought that was spot on. Good tagline. Slightly longer explanation might be an elevator spiel, something that you would say to a stranger in an elevator if they asked you, so what is it you do? But today, I will give you a more in-depth explanation of software architect's role aimed at those who want to become one. What do you think about when you think of a software architect? When I think about software architects, or at least I used to, I think about consultants, these people who we bring in on a temporary basis to either start us off on a new big project, to implement a new technology or platform, or sometimes to save a project from circling the drain. They usually come in with a title and they are temporary. They don't stay for too long. But what about people who work for companies or government or academia? Aren't there architects there who stay in one place for a long time and don't travel the world as part of their jobs? Well, now is a good time to introduce myself. I am a software engineer who is now a software architect of many years. And these days I lead teams of software engineers, but I do still architect solutions, especially when they're heavily cross-functional. And as Eva mentioned, I've specialized in healthcare for a good number of years at this point. I love the industry. It is the most rewarding one yet. I really appreciate the opportunity to make a positive impact in patients' lives. Now, Eva asked me to talk a little bit more about me. Usually this section is pretty short. I'll add that my career in healthcare is entirely accidental. I've worked in a number of industries, and what I noticed is that every other job that I had, literally every other one, would be in healthcare. And what I realized is, in addition to it being a very rewarding job, there's a lot of value to be had out of being both the technologist and someone who knows the vertical, the business. And I started specializing because that knowledge got deeper and deeper, and I could leverage it more and more in next steps of my career. So not necessarily a very directed career, but it landed in a fun place. So how or when did I realize that I was a software architect? I think I first realized that I was an architect, I think maybe during a third presentation of solution options to stakeholders, when the first two failed to get buy-in, and I had to make major adjustments to proposals. Or maybe it was after I got buy-in, but only for a phased implementation, and my proposal for this beautiful architecture was slashed and gutted because of timeline constraints. I realized then that there's a lot of compromises in this line of work. And if you know a definition of a good compromise, it's when no one walks away too happy. And that was definitely one of those times. So what is the role of a software architect? In a nutshell, software architect provides leadership. That is the answer. This is the entire nut of this presentation. But of course, we'll go into deeper detail of what that means. One of the reasons why I do this talk is because I don't think it's readily apparent to many people that leadership is a primary function of a software architect. It became very obvious to me when I ended up in an organization where leadership qualities by themselves held no value. The primary contribution that was valued was code. And because of that, both organizational and architectural dysfunctions emerged. So today I will talk about what kind of leadership software architects provide, what skills they need to provide it, and how to avoid certain common pitfalls. So there are three types of leadership that software architect provides: people, thought, and technical leadership. Software architect operates at the intersection of the three and utilizes all three to be successful. In order to be an effective leader in each area, architect needs to develop specific skills that I will go through, starting with our first, and I would argue the most important one, people leadership. So what exactly do you do there? In a word, influence. What you're ultimately trying to do is get a buy-in for your solution, explaining to the stakeholders what value the solution will bring. And that value proposition is very important. Every stakeholder will ask, what's in it for me? And when I use the word solution here, it's a very broad definition of a solution. It can be anything from the true technical software solution to change in a business process, or maybe change in a technical process like your deployment procedure, to organizational or socio-technical change. Influencing involves a lot of conversations at different levels, from technical to project, to product management, to C-suite. It also involves sifting through a lot of feedback and either incorporating the feedback or having reasoned arguments why it shouldn't be. After these multiple cycles of separating wheat from the chaff, what you end up with is a compromise, but ultimately one that serves every part of organization that you're solving for. I would argue, again, that this is the most important one. If people don't listen or follow you, your solution is not going to see the light of day. So There are a lot of famous laws and quotes out there, and they typically get brought out in these talks. I will definitely hit a few of them. My hope is that Conway's law is familiar to most people. Effectively, what Conway says is that org structure influences architecture. Now, architect influences architecture quite directly. She tries to shape it. What hasn't been obvious is that architect can also influence architecture indirectly by influencing organizational structure, aligning teams to value streams, platforms, complex subsystems. There's a lot of good material out there on this topic. One of the most recent interesting books is Team Topologies by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pace, and it talks about evolving teams for better software delivery. As an architect, you can bring this knowledge and help shape the organization, which will help shape the architecture. So the next area is growing new leadership in architects. It is difficult to accomplish big objectives alone, and it's not really all that much fun. The best way to get another peer architect is to train one. Find someone who aspires to reach the next level and provide necessary guidance and opportunity to develop these skills that I'm talking about now. Knowledge sharing is another very important part of people leadership. Architect is often a hub of information. They're exposed to quite a big range, from technical to business to product to project management. They can meaningfully convey information to various functions. They also interpret information and understand potential impacts. In fact, in my current position, I find myself doing a lot of this translation of what are the software implications of a particular business initiative. These translations can actually get very complex. Since architects have this information, it becomes incumbent upon them to ensure that team members have the right information at the right time and at the right level. So, what skills do you need in order to be an effective people leader? It sounds funny, but you need people skills. First, to influence, you need to understand motivation and find personal approach. Some people are going to be motivated by learning, some by recognition, some by building something cool and new. Teams are going to have different motivations. Executive team might be motivated by revenue or budget, marketing by getting product out for an industry event, regulatory team by compliance with regs, sales team by being able to gain broader territory. Coaching and teaching skills are critical for growing talent and creating next generation of architects. Providing guidance and feedback and not just doing everything yourself is an important skill. So important. I had this just recently where I was training somebody new on the team, and it was a short task. I could have done it in half an hour, but I needed to train somebody else, and it took a lot longer. But that's what it takes to share that information and train. You do need to learn to delegate and support others as they work through problems without giving all the answers. And you need to create room for experimentation and mistakes. Have some tolerance for mistakes, but make sure to set the guardrails to avoid catastrophic failures. Communication skills are very important. You probably already noticed that all skills here involve some level of communication. And even though they call it a soft skill, I would argue that it's quite hard, as in difficult, to be a great communicator. What does it mean to be a great communicator? It means engaging in healthy and constructive debate, putting together well-reasoned arguments, avoiding groupthink. Oh, everybody thinks this is a good idea, so I'm just going to go along. Listening and absorbing rather than reacting. You know, I've had a lot of these, this is a bad idea. Immediate reaction. Wait, process the information, process all of the information before responding. It also means tailoring your message to the audience and having the right amount of detail. I can talk about the same initiative to C-suite and to technical team, and the language is going to be vastly different. And that skill is very critical to being understood. I had a really good example of how critical that skill is just recently when a colleague of mine who was a senior engineer got elevated to a leadership position. Suddenly his audience was comprised of executives from various functions, but he never adapted his language and he continued to address everybody as if he was talking to a group of engineers. The frustration on both sides was palpable. Neither side felt understood or felt like they were getting the right information. And this, of course, goes beyond verbal skills. A good architect wants to write things down and understands the value of written word. This, of course, can be very counter to all of the agile methodologies that we've been taught, where code is the only documentation that you need, minimal documentation. Anybody who said that has never been in an audit. You don't want to put your code in front of an auditor, and audits can be part of the enterprise. If your objective for an auditor is to have them ask as few questions as possible and to go away as fast as possible, putting code in front of them is not the right strategy. Writing things down helps organize your thoughts and allows everybody to level set and disseminate information. I imagine everyone has been in that one meeting where you get a new problem to understand. You spend an hour in a group talking about it. You walk out with a pretty good understanding of the problem, only to realize that next time you got together, everybody walked away with a slightly different understanding of a problem. Writing things down and making them obvious helps level everybody's understanding. Now, I want to digress for a minute and talk about this concept of near enemy. Near enemy and far enemy come from Buddhism, and there's these 4 Buddhist virtues and their enemies. While a far enemy is obvious, it's a complete opposite of the virtue. Near enemy may look very similar to the virtue, but actually differ in a dangerous way. Similarly, each leadership skill that the architect should possess has a near enemy that may look like that leadership, but can differ in subtle and unhelpful way. So, what's the near enemy of people leadership? It is functional management. Now, I want to be very clear. There's nothing wrong with functional management. In fact, it's a very necessary skill. Functional manager hires, fires, provides feedback, builds a team, works in career skills and development. In short, she's a people manager. She's also a manager of a particular function, let's say manufacturing, and is responsible for execution of all projects that involve that function. That is a different set of responsibilities, managing resources, budgets, timelines, processes, and technical aspects of a project. This is where it can get tricky. Pure functional management without influence component doesn't really get you as far. Bringing it back to software, there are 2 types of architects, with teams and without, meaning those who manage functional teams and those who don't. I've seen both kinds, I've been both kinds, and I would argue that being one without a team is more challenging because you really need to leverage your influence to get anything accomplished. However, when you have a team, it's easy to fall into the trapping of thinking that you can accomplish what you need with your position alone, and you no longer need to rely on your influence heavily. So what does functional management look like without influence? It looks like this, telling people what to do, task mastering. You may accomplish your objectives because you have position, but if you don't have buy-in, the support for your decisions will be grudging at best. And the effect of this, do it because I said so, is that decision already made get reopened frequently, and that slows down progress. And of course, position power extends to your team only. It doesn't really work on stakeholders, doesn't work on cross-functional teams. So bigger projects become much more difficult to accomplish. If I contrast this with people leadership with influence, much of this is getting buy-in, and that starts with the value proposition, explaining what value the initiative will bring. And it also making people feel like they're part of the solution. And nothing makes people feel like they're a part of the solution than thinking that they came up with the solution. Everybody wants their idea to succeed. So inception that solution into them, give them credit, make sure the project is successful. So moving on to our second leadership, technical leadership. How does a software architect lead in the technology realm? First, by constant learning. You have to know technology in order to make educated choices, understand trade-offs. We all know how fast technology moves. There's always something new. There's patterns, practices, trends, frameworks. How many JavaScript frameworks are out there? Now, this constant learning, of course, comes paired with teaching and information sharing that I talked about. In order for knowledge to be applied, it can't be hoarded. Architect evangelizes to the team, shows value of new things, and drives progress. Second, technical leadership takes shape of scaffolding projects. While you may not be able to implement a project start to finish, creating a scaffold for implementation ensures that your design materializes as you envisioned it and cements patterns. What the scaffold really is depends on the project. It can be anything: technology selection, data model, workflow or process definition, integration paradigm, API definition, service boundary, any combination of those things. Since architecture is about important stuff, whatever that is, famous quote, figure out what is important or foundational to the project and scaffold it. Another approach from the opposite side is you can identify what is likely to go wrong and cause a big collapse and focus on scaffolding it. Third, technical leadership is selecting a toolbox. I'll go back to my question of how many JavaScript frameworks are out there. Angular, Node, React, Vue, so many. How many do you need? One, hopefully one. How do you know which one is better? How do you know which one is better for this project or maybe long term? How do you balance that with a skill set you already have on your team? Architects analyze tools. They collaborate in tool selection. They collaborate on training and rollout. Another important thing that they do, again, from the other side of the spectrum, is they prevent tool proliferation and duplication. One JavaScript framework. And this, by the way, often happens with logging and monitoring tools. I've never been anywhere where we only had just one. And the latest iteration, I've actually seen 4 different ones. Your New Relics and Splunk and SolarWinds. Did we need all of these? Probably not, but people brought in what they knew. And without architect leading that conversation, you end up with too many tools sometimes. So what skills do you need to be a tech lead? Again, as funny as it sounds, technical skills, but let's break those down. For constant learning, it's the 4 C's. I actually don't know if this reference plays. I don't know if that book is well known outside of the United States. All I really need to know, I learned in kindergarten. But the 4 C's are the skills that they teach you in kindergarten and up. And they're critical thinking, creative thinking, communication, and collaboration. Notice that communication shows up here too. For building a scaffold, you need your software engineering skills. And I know there's a lot there to unpack, but I will summarize it as foundational engineering or coding skills, plus tools and frameworks, plus best practice thinking. So these are your patterns. To fill out your toolbox with the right tools, your best friends are your analytical skills. You're doing a lot of market surveillance, which is not the same thing as the looking for the next shiny thing, although shiny things are fun. Aside from technical need and fit, there's many more aspects to evaluate. For example, maturity of the tool and whether you're willing or able to be early adopter in a heavily regulated industry like healthcare, which is where I work. We often can't afford to take on tools that haven't been vetted by time. Other aspects might be a level of support you will get, licensing considerations, current skill set makeup of your team, and your ability to either hire or train the right skill set. And whether these new skills are going to elevate your team or maybe do the opposite. Of course, technical leadership has its own near enemy, and that near enemy is just being a really in the weeds individual contributor with hands on keyboard all the time. Now, just like there's nothing wrong with being a functional manager, there's nothing wrong with being an individual contributor. That's just an architect without a team. And of course, it's great to keep your coding skills sharp. I'll talk about that in a minute. However, being really deep in the weeds and having tactical coding responsibilities, stories you need to deliver, bugs you need to fix, rarely leaves time for broader strategy. Remember the organization that I mentioned where leadership skills weren't valued? I initially went along and started delivering tactically, and I felt like this guy in the comic, and as long as I was deep in the code, I had no time to deal with anything strategic, even basic things like tool selection for the team. And the moment I started working on strategic initiatives, I became a bottleneck for code delivery. But the question that I asked myself is, can I be an architect without coding every day? It is a hard question. My answer to that is yes, but with some conscious effort behind it. In my experience, few things helped. Doing proofs of concepts, greenfield projects, new tech evaluation projects, all of these are variations on a theme, and the theme is something new is being brought in. You can try this out, learn the technology, go as deep or as shallow as you want because the risk is low. Your code is not likely to go straight to production, not without some major rework. So if you get an opportunity to execute on those, take it. Second is keep a pet project, that is. Many of us end up with this situation where there's some piece of software or project that you've contributed heavily to some time ago, and somehow you're still shepherding it to this day, whether it makes sense or not. Well, you're already familiar with the code base, and occasional implementation of a new feature pattern can keep your skills sharp. The last category is not a desirable occurrence, when an architect needs to roll up her sleeves and start coding in order to rescue a project. Though when it does happen, it gives you an opportunity to level up in high pressure situation. So even if you don't code every day, if you maintain this sine wave pattern of diving deep and then coming back out to strategic initiatives, you can maintain your skills. Finally, our last leadership bubble, thought leadership. This is strategic leadership, which starts out with big picture thinking. Architects live at big picture level. They harmonize requirements, technologies, solutions. Start by understanding what the big picture is right now, learn some of its past history, how it evolved, and what were the lessons of that evolution. You will want to know how the current lumps and bumps were acquired and how to avoid them, but be aware that this is a balancing act. You want to know the lessons, but you don't want to be so bogged down for it as to fear change. Once you know what the big picture looks like, roadmap its evolution. You want to have a roadmap beyond your next release, but you don't want the roadmap too far in the future. Things change fast. I've seen 3-year plans that have never ever became what they were initially. So the most practical planning period, in my opinion, is somewhere between 6 months to a year. What is this roadmap? I heard a wonderful line one time: architect is a technical product manager. And I think it's very true. And it's a technology roadmap for your systems that you're maintaining. That roadmap is a living entity that you will maintain through the lifetime of your systems. Next, champion process. So process tends to be a dirty word in software development. You probably remember move fast and break things. However, having come from a regulated industry where mistakes can be very costly and affect people's lives and well-being, I've come to appreciate the role of software development process and champion in the organization. Process can get associated with something very heavy-handed, very waterfall, documentation that no one maintains. Doesn't have to be the case. Process is there to do two things. One is to catch you when you fall, and it's not if, it's when, because mistakes always get made. And it's also there to instill good engineering discipline, doing code reviews, getting peer feedback, following best practices. The key point to remember is that process serves developers, not the other way around. It's up to the software architect to continuously evaluate and improve the process so that it works for your specific organization or industry. Software development process in a small growing organization is going to look very different than that in a large mature organization, regulated versus unregulated, and so on. In short, architect champions process and makes it yet another tool in their toolbox. Last, set culture and values. Management consultant Peter Drucker once said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Does it mean that all the strategy stuff I just talked about is not important? Not at all. What it does speak to is to the power of culture and how critical it is to success of organization and projects. Software architects should have values, and they're in a unique position to build, change, or influence culture in their organization. Here's where being an architect who is also a team lead makes it easier to set culture, at least within your own team, and most especially at the formative stages, hiring, onboarding, and so on. However, culture within a single team is often not enough. No single team is an island, and architects should work to influence culture across teams. So what are the values that software architect might have? I'll give you some of mine. I do hope you think about what you consider your North Star and explain it, to yourself and others. So starting with my first value, simplicity. I don't actually think this value is sufficiently appreciated. I hope you know who said this quote. This is not a new value in the land of software. We work in a complex and ever-changing field. We're expected to be experts in the technology, be very well-versed in the vertical business aspects. We solve complex problems, and complexity will naturally arise in our solutions. So these things that we have to solve is our essential complexity. And then there is other kinds of complexity, the kind that happens when we want to try and future-proof, add bells and whistles, obsessed with clean code, design patterns. Why is simplicity a value that I espouse to? First, simple solutions decrease cognitive load. Cognitive load is basically the amount of mental effort that you have to expend to solve a problem. Mental capacity is limited, at least mine is, and you want to focus the capacity that you have on the essential complexity. If everything is complex, you eventually run out of that capacity because you have to keep solving non-essential problems. And what I can tell you is every industry has its own complexity. It's not just rocket science or healthcare. There's always some essential complexity to it. Second, simple solutions are maintainable. And if you think about where you spend most of the time, it's not solution design or implementation, it's maintenance. Unnecessarily complex solutions will make things difficult, causing a whole range of issues. There's a couple of things that I like to do to reduce cognitive load. And one of them, actually, I elevate into a value. I call it, for short, naming things. And this is another famous quote by Phil Carlton. I drag it out pretty often when I want the team to think about how they're naming things. And honestly, this is no less important now than when this quote was first coined. Why does it matter? Bad names introduce high cognitive load. You've probably all seen code where every variable is X, Y, or Z. Method names look like alphabet soup. It gets hard to follow and make sense of it. This is the software that doesn't fit in our heads. Once the names, the language that we use gets memorialized in code, it also is difficult to change. And then combined cognitive load on the team is very costly. We should strive to reduce it by using clear and descriptive names that reflect your domain and function. And if you're familiar with domain-driven design, this is called ubiquitous language, and software architect help shape it. So let's talk about some examples. You might think that naming things is a new problem. It's not. This other fun little quote tells you that people were concerned with appropriate name for things many, many, many years ago. So what do I want out of a name? I want to be able to hear a name and understand what it is or what it does. I'll give you some examples with various levels of cognitive load, and we'll see if we can make sense of them. So here's the first one. These, by the way, come from the lens of service design. So just picture there's a word service following each one of these. So here's one called auth. Can you guess what it does? Authentication, maybe. Authorization, perhaps. I don't know from looking at the name. Turned out that it was authentication. And when I asked why the service was given this name, I was told that it was intentionally vague because initially the engineer didn't know whether it was going to do one or both, also which one. So I thought that was really wrong for two reasons. One, there's this thing called single responsibility principle where we don't want to throw multiple disparate things into the same service. But the second one, intentionally vague means somebody intended to confuse their fellow developers and increase their cognitive load. I can forgive accidentally vague, but intentionally vague is just bad. Another example, and this is an interesting one because what's our typical service naming pattern? It's noun service or verb service, order service, ticketing service. There's a fun new one, adjective service. When I saw this word clinical, I started fitting nouns after it. This is what my brain does. It automatically fit nouns behind it. It's like clinical trial, clinical outcome, clinical evidence. Turned out to be none of those things. And this is a little like naming service, beautiful or robust or medical. Name does not give you a clue as to the function. Here's another one, MISC. This is not even miscellaneous, it's just MISC. Any idea what it does? I asked this question once at a live conference and I got a fun answer. It's like everything else. Yeah, it's a kind of a junk drawer of services. Anything that you didn't know where to put, just threw in there. Imagine trying to parse what this thing does. Lastly, I'll give you a counterpoint. Problem case creation service. Do you know what it does? Easy guess, probably creates problem cases. Maybe you don't know what problem case is, what's it used for, but when you see this thing on an architecture diagram, you don't have too many more questions about what's happening in this little box. Imagine if you encountered MISC here. So in summary, spend a little bit of time to find a name that reflects a form or function. Be intentionally clear, don't abbreviate, don't be stingy with words. If you are finding yourself using too many words, maybe think about if you're breaking a single responsibility principle. And remember that names stick. Changing them is really hard and combined cognitive load can be very costly. So next value, my value is no dogma. There has always been trends in software development and architecture that change decade over decade. You can probably name some. The word microservices, super popular these days. I don't tend to adopt trends wholly. I find it very restrictive. Always use cases that come up that don't fit a chosen architecture type or trend or pattern. It doesn't really make sense to fit use cases to architecture. It really should be the other way around. If you start kind of doing this fitting square peg in a round hole, you lose nuance of that particular use case. Methodologies are there to serve us. So rather than keeping to a particular methodology, I pick and choose those aspects that suit the project needs best, and I don't worry about being very formal about the rest of it. One example that I can give, which is process rather than architectural patterns, is Agile. I work in healthcare. I think I said that like 4 times already, and that's heavily regulated. True Agile with all its attributes is not possible for us. However, I can take best aspects of Agile, such as self-organizing teams, getting quick feedback from stakeholders, and incorporate it in my process. I am never going to have releases that go out weekly because we have to put some rigor behind documentation and other things. But it doesn't mean that I haven't benefited from Agile methodology. So if I were to put this in a positive term, I would say no dogma equals pragmatism. This pragmatism extends to a specific case that I elevate into a value, which is apply patterns practically. As software engineers, we learn design patterns. Many of you, I'm sure, have read Gang of Four book, other books that talk about software patterns. And we often jump to implementing patterns before pattern actually emerges. And sometimes you hear it quite a bit in the design discussions where, oh, this seems to fit this pattern. Patterns too early introduce unnecessary complexity. And I just talked about how simplicity is my first value. So I try to go the simplest path possible. So a couple of definitions of a word pattern. First one's pretty standard. The second one, I find this word to be the most important word of the definition, repeated. If you see one of something, is it a pattern? What about 2 of something? What about 3? I tend to use the rule of 3. You probably noticed that a lot of stuff in this presentation comes in 3s. And the phrase that I heard once that I really like is 1 is an accident, 2 is a coincidence, 3 is a pattern. This comic I really enjoyed because somebody tried to make a pattern out of 2 things rather than 3, and it didn't work too well for them. So when I encounter 1 of something, I implement it the simplest possible way. 2 of something, I am not opposed to cutting and pasting. It's a perfectly valid strategy when you have 2 of something. When you see a 3, you can probably determine a pattern and eat the cost of refactoring of everything to actually use a proper design pattern. All right, so back to skills of our thought leadership. So these are not skills in the most strict sense of the word, but they are more character traits. The unifying theme here is drive for constant improvement and being a change agent. You're not normally satisfied with status quo. You strive to make things better. You need to be capable of using any experience, success or failure, for learning. You have that desire to go back and understand why something succeeded or failed, draw conclusions, course correct if needed. Have that flexibility, have tolerance for failure, curiosity, willingness to experiment, and one of the very important ones is emotional intelligence. You are driving change, and change is hard. You want to be sensitive to how the teams absorb and process change. All right, so we should talk about what is the near enemy of thought leadership. And in this case, it is an ivory tower architect. Ivory tower architect makes architecture a very academic exercise without a real and practical value attached to it. Remember that at the end of the day, you have to ship working software that provides business value. If you don't have that, the architecture itself has no value. Ivory tower architects often get enamored with the right way of doing things rather than balancing out right with pragmatic or sometimes realistic. And architecture is never a clean and pretty picture. There's always compromises and trade-offs that need to be made. One sign that you might have an ivory tower architect is they make architecture process very exclusionary, creating committees and approval boards. Architecture process is a lot more democratic. If you ask me who architects software, I'd say everyone, from product team to engineering to quality. Architect just happens to be the person who drives the process, responsible for producing the artifacts and accountable for the results. The other sign of ivory tower is process for the sake of process. Places where you see process as bureaucratic, used to check boxes rather than provide practical value, or sometimes reactive, where mistakes are dealt with by adding more and more process, is also typical of academic mindset. To avoid that, always ask yourself, what value does a particular decision or process change bring to the table? And if the answer is unclear or none, avoid it. So, what do architects actually do in practical terms, other than press the proverbial computer buttons? I'll outline a 4-phase process and artifacts for each phase. This is going to look very neat in PowerPoint. Everything always looks very neat in PowerPoint. But the process is not that linear. There's loops and returns, and phases are different size and scale. So the first thing that architect will do is get to the core of a problem, performing analysis that supports their problem definition. This is typically a pretty big task that requires eliciting information from multiple stakeholders. There's your communication skills again. Creating a succinct and meaningful problem statement is critical to building a solution. Otherwise, where are you going? How do you know where you're trying to go? And I'll say just maybe another couple of sentences about problem statements. They are, I learned this framework for creating problem statements that makes it very, very simple. By all means, you should have all the context and data, but problem statement contains one of the two things, either good outcomes that aren't happening or bad outcomes that are. If you keep that framework in mind, it becomes very easy to create good problem statements. And an example of, we're losing $25 million annually due to bad billing practices. Great problem statement. You know exactly where you want to go from here, which is stop losing $25 million annually, or get that number down to something that business is willing to live with. The artifacts produced are problem statement, of course, supporting analysis. If you're giving specific numbers, which you almost always should, you should back them up with data, and some as-is documentation. If you have that destination, you should have a starting point as well. This is the phase where you create your solution proposal, or should I say proposals. As it goes through the vetting process, it'll probably change, and sometimes significantly. This is the time for diagrams. We knew there was going to be time for diagrams and any other to-be documentation. A few other very important things that happen at this phase. If there's any technology selection to be made, it happens here. Any proofs of concepts to be done happen here. And the other important output of this phase is names for concepts or ubiquitous language. You will discover most of your ubiquitous language in the first phase during problem definition, but for anything new that you're introducing, you have to name it, and this is where those names enter the language. This is the phase where you take your solution from concept or proof of concept to production. So consulting architects don't often stay for this phase. And you can see the artifacts. This is where you're building your scaffold, or if possible or necessary, production code. The most important thing that you're doing in this phase is managing change. As implementation starts, you will discover assumptions that have not been voiced, requirements creep, technology limitations that previously undiscovered, and you're likely going to have to adapt your design to compensate for these new discoveries. This last phase, which is always the longest, is enhancement and maintenance. These chevrons are not drawn to scale, otherwise this one would take most of the slide. Code is running in production, and you get to live with consequences of your decisions, which is what distinguishes an in-house architect from a consultant. The measure of success is not whether you have to make a change. The answer to that question is always yes. The measure of success is how big of a change do you need to make and how easily can you make it. All right, so I talked at the start about having a tagline that will describe a role of a software architect. I know the analogy with civil architects and building a house has been used many times. It is a good one for a reason. There are many moving parts behind a facade, and this is your last diagram of the day, plumbing diagram. And visualizing those things that are hidden and putting them together in a working solution, the kind that doesn't make you take a cold shower when the dishwasher is running, is something that the architect does. So my take on the tagline is making the invisible visible. So summary, role of a software architect is to provide leadership in 3 major areas: people, technical, and thought. And if you are leading in these 3 areas, you might already be an architect. Thank you. All right.
Thank you so much, Sonya.
My pleasure.
So we have a lot of questions. I think some of them are answered already, but I'll ask them anyways. Maybe you have something to say about it. So the first question we got is, what are your thoughts and ideas to make architecture more attractive to women?
Oh, you give me the hardest question from jump. More attractive. This one is hard for me to answer because I am a problem solver by nature. So any area where you solve problems is attractive to me. Maybe what I can say about this is it's a great equalizer. There's no major secrets. There's no very special skills. You can arrive at architecture same way any man does. And if you're interested in solving problems, this should be something that you explore. I don't want to make it necessarily gender specific, but it's just, if it's a field that attracts you, if you like solving problems, I think you will find a very, very rich strata of problems, interesting problems to solve, and you should jump right in.
Thank you. That's a good answer. So the second question is, where do you see architecture in the next 5 or 10 years?
I've gone away from predicting things. One thing I'll say is patterns tend to re-emerge after a certain cycle. They get a little different. They change because underlying technology changes. I think the biggest shift that we've had in the last 10 years is move to cloud, which fundamentally changed certain architecture patterns. But overall, underlying principles are very similar. And if you saw some of the quotes, they're old. They've been around almost as long as software engineering have been around. And if you look at some of the latest trends, microservices, different take on service-oriented architecture with some of the very similar underlying principles. So I would say, you don't worry about where it will be. If you want to go with it, go with it. I promise everything that you've learned in your current or past iteration is going to be applicable in some shape or form. Don't feel overwhelmed by the new things that come down.
You make this seem not easy, but something that we can achieve. The way you're answering the questions, that's very nice, because software architecture seems very not necessarily hard, but difficult and challenging maybe.
Yeah, it's an example from my personal experience. When I felt overwhelmed, I came into a new organization and everything felt very familiar because it was similar business, but everything was done somewhat differently. And I felt really overwhelmed at the start. And I think the best advice I got was from my former colleague who said, do what you always do. Make a plan and then execute on a plan. So there's no magic to it. And if the plan has to change, then change the plan. You learn something new and you change the plan. So it may seem daunting. I understand why, but you will make sense of it.
Thank you. We have a lot of more questions to go through. Do I need to be an expert programmer to become an architect?
Experience helps, and knowing technology helps. Expert is kind of a funny word. I don't know what qualifies an expert. I've seen really, really good engineers who've never had any formal engineering training, and I've seen engineers who had a lot of formal trainings who weren't very good. But I think what's most important is understanding how technologies are used, the purpose for them, the intent, and being thoughtful about that intent. So if you know a technology, don't try to jam it into everything, into every solution. Try and understand what fits best for a given solution and then apply it. It's being nuanced about technologies is going to help. Being an expert in a particular technology, I don't think it's critical to it.
That was a great answer. And I think many can feel familiar with using one technology in all projects thing, especially when you're new, maybe. So what were the challenges you faced becoming an architect?
It took me a little bit of time to realize that learning business is just as important as learning technology and learning the breadth of business, which can be complex. I've seen engineers kind of shy away from it and say, oh, why do I need to know this? Why do I care how that department over there does its job? It's not immediately applicable to what I do. But I think stepping out of what's immediately applicable and having a broader view, I think is the first challenge, to myself that I had to overcome and say, okay, I need to step out of my space, out of my comfort zone to learn more in order to be really effective. I think that's one. The second one is really that transition into architecture. It's not particularly formal. While I've been working, there hasn't been really formal titles until recently about it, and kind of accepting that this is what I do now and that's what it's called. It was a very interesting change for me.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit before the stream and you told me that you were a software engineer before you became an architect. I can't remember that you said it in your presentation, but I think that's also very, I think it's great to hear that you can start somewhere as a software engineer and then work your way up. I think it's very, very promising.
Absolutely, yeah. I think actually going from software engineer to an architect is probably the most direct path. I was at a conference where, with a bunch of software architects, and I was actually pleasantly surprised in how diverse the backgrounds were. Some were from product, some were from other spaces. But the most traditional one, I would say, is you are an engineer, you go into engineering leadership, go into architecture.
Yeah. So one of the questions was, how close to the development and developers are you in your daily work?
Fairly close. Let me try and be very specific. I get into code once in a while, at least in my position now. It's not super frequent, but people will put code in front of me and we will talk about it. A lot of new projects, especially new in the sense that we haven't done this before, we don't have a pattern for it yet, I get involved pretty deeply with to establish initial architecture before I feel like we have a good stable idea of where we're going. And then I tend to hand them off to senior engineers to take through. And I rely on them to come back to me and say, hey, you know, this thing that we originally thought about, we don't think it's going to work because, you know, we discovered something. How do we adapt this? Or we've adapted it like so. Do you think there's any challenges with this? So I know how, you know, what the shape of the new initiatives is for more or less every new initiative on my team.
And do you work in projects where architects deliver in sequential phases, or in autonomous and self-driven product teams where architecture is developed with the teams and developers?
It's the latter. Everything is being done with the teams. The organization that I'm with now doesn't have a formal software architecture function, which is fine. It's a growing organization, but I think that's changing. So everything is done with the teams, and we rely on heavy collaboration across teams when we have a major cross-functional project to make sure that all of the boxes and lines fit well together.
So shouldn't the developers and teams have the freedom to select the technology?
Absolutely. I don't typically insist on a particular technology as long as it fits the use case that we're trying to support, and as long as it doesn't proliferate heavily. I talked about tool proliferation, and one of the things, for example, one fun thing is various durable queues. We probably have 3 different types of queues that we use in the org. That's, I think, too many. We can stick to one. And that's where I would question if somebody's bringing something new in. Why, when we already have a proven solution in-house? But beyond that, yes, they should have that freedom.
So it's kind of the same question, just phrased differently. So how much influence should the architect have over tech decisions?
I tried to quantify that a little bit. And if somebody's bringing a new technology that they say is going to be the cat's pajamas, the next greatest thing, I want to understand, first of all, how it fits to an initiative, because I don't want this to be technology for the sake of technology. And I want to have almost a tabular format of objectives that technology is going to fulfill and how it's going to fulfill it, with a couple of options. So for example, what is it that we're evaluating in this technology? Maintainability, getting us to market faster. So have these categories and have an evaluation of, it'll do this well, that not well, this really, really great, and that's why we should choose it. I want to have that value proposition very, very solid before we decide on something new to go with.
Over to a different topic. Are there any specific qualification one needs to have to lead a tech team in the healthcare industry?
Specifically in healthcare industry, honestly, it helps to have a science background. I don't have a science background, which puts me at a disadvantage. So I made it a point to absorb as much science from either my colleagues over on the scientific side or just, of my own learnings. I think that becomes very important to speak meaningfully to your colleagues and partners and be able to make a difference. Like, we're a clinical laboratory. If I don't know what my business does or how it does it to some degree, I can't be effective. Other than that, it's a pretty typical engineering team, same one you'd find in technology field.
Back to a topic we've covered. Doesn't those sequential phases mean you work in waterfall? And I disagree that enhancement comes last. Shouldn't we continuously make it better?
So maybe a piece that I said that didn't land is, this looks very neat and sequential in PowerPoint, but there are loops and returns to those phases. If we got past problem statement and we got to design, and then we were looking at design and thought, maybe we're solving the wrong problem, or we discovered another problem, we go back to the problem statement. So it's not a super linear process start to finish. It's just easier to portray it. Otherwise it starts looking like a hairball if I have all of the loops and returns. And yes, we should continually make it better. And if you have a very, very agile team that has something in production in 2 weeks, then everything after that initial production launch becomes your enhancement and maintenance. You might still be building major features, but you're no longer officially greenfield.
The person who asked the healthcare question says, thank you for the elaborated answer. So next question, what learning resources do you tune into to keep yourself informed and knowledgeable?
A couple of places where I go to often. O'Reilly has a great platform. I try to tune into an occasional talk there. Sometimes those are easier than reading through. I do read actually a good quantity of blogs that come my way. I really, really miss in-person conferences because in addition to the talks there, just talking to people and learning directly from them, I feel is very integral part of learning. And more formalized courses, Pluralsight, some of the LinkedIn learning, I pick up as I see fit. Those have been super useful.
You're not alone in the conference thing. We all missed the conference. So does certifications affect your chances of becoming an architect? In general, how are certifications regarded in light of architecture?
I think you're asking the wrong person here. I am not huge on certifications, to be honest with you. I think they do help. I think from a pure, if you're applying for a job, if you're looking for next opportunity, I think having certificates does help. On paper, you look better. In practice, I really look at what practical applications have you had of whatever it is that you're certified in. If you look like you took a course, got a certificate and never used it in practice, to me, that's less valuable than I learned it by myself. Maybe I took a course and never really got certified. But I have some practical application of the skills that I learned.
So this is a statement. It's harder for architects to find their place in organizations that are highly agile. In other words, those that move away from projects to organizing development into product teams. What do you think about this?
I think it's true. I think Agile kind of pitted us against formal architecture and made formal architecture more of this is a big upfront design process. I think architects can position themselves better if they show how they can right-size the process rather than say, I think what became difficult is having a big committee that says, all right, well, you do big upfront design, then come back to the committee, get approval, and then go and implement it. That's what is in conflict with Agile. If you can right-size design and say, we should expend this much time on vetting out this new technology, figuring out this new paradigm, and have tangible objectives that you're setting for yourself as an architect in, 1 sprint, 2 sprints, we will know X or Y, we will make a decision around this. I think it becomes a lot easier to sell.
How have you been able to maintain people leadership component of the architect position during COVID? Has it been?
Oh no, I think I lost you, Ingrid, Elisa.
I lost you. Are you back?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're back.
I'm back. Okay, sorry.
You froze for me for a minute.
Perfect. Did you get the question?
No. Would you mind repeating this, please?
No problem. How have you been able to maintain people leadership component of the architect position during COVID? Has it been easier or more difficult to perform these tasks using Zoom, for instance?
I think there was definitely an adaptation process. We got a few new cool tools. I'll say that much. That was very useful to find new collaboration tools that we've leveraged pretty heavily. That said, communication does get more difficult. I do miss having people in the room, having body language be available and say, oh, you know, and kind of being able to read the room, elicit things a lot faster, I think, when we're in person. So that piece is missing to me. And people leadership does become harder. You have to, with COVID, it's just been a challenging year for everybody, and you need to make a lot of adjustments for any complexity in personal life that your team might have encountered.
Okay, thank you. That was actually the last question. Although we have a delay on the YouTube stream, so I'm thinking maybe to give them 1 minute in case there's other questions. Otherwise, Eva is taking over from here.
Yes.
So thank you so much.
But we had a great Q&A session, and thank you, Sonya, for an amazing talk and for amazing Q&A session, which was a little bit longer than we discussed at the beginning. But
it was my pleasure.
But we've learned a lot, and we are very grateful for having you with us tonight. And I would also like to thank everyone who joined us today, and please follow us on all the social media to be updated on our next events. See you.
Thank you. Take care.
Yes.